So hello and happy Friday. Welcome to Frequently Asked Questions about Backyard Beekeeping, episode number 38. This is the way to be, and it's Friday, November 8th. Guess what the temperature is outside? 33 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's snow everywhere, as you saw during the intro. So, it's cold, it's unpleasant. The bees aren't doing anything. There's some dead bees on the landing board because the temperature dropped fast and the storm came in pretty quick. And so now the bees are all clustered inside their hives. And this is where all the resources that they've worked so hard to collect will mean so much. If you're new, welcome. If you're returning, thank you to those of you who posted questions. If you have a question for me and you'd like to see it discussed next week on Friday, then please write that down in the video description. No, write that down in the video comment section. And then we'll be able to discuss some of the things that you post that are relevant to many viewers. The other thing is you can look down in the video description to see what topics we're going to cover today, line by line. We don't have a lot, so this is probably going to go fairly quick. Thank you for joining me. If you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. And in the lower right-hand corner, after you subscribe, you'll see that there's a little bell, and you touch on the little gray bell, and you see the little echo marks on it, little resonance lines, and that shows that you'll get notifications when a new video posts from me. So, there's that. Let's get right into it. The very first question is by Jack Tomberlin. Do you ever add pollen substitutes to your dry sugar, and what is your take on that, good or bad? Well, I like to talk a little bit first about when do you have dry sugar on. For me, and we discussed this in our last FAQ, the dry sugar gets put in the hive, usually in the top, on paper, in an open feeder, or some container that gets your bees in close proximity to it, so that in an emergency, your bees inside the hive during winter, when they can't fly out, will have access to some kind of sugar carbohydrate energy source that will carry them over through that hardship in the wintertime. Let's remember first that the most important thing that you can be feeding your bees that you can leave on for them to get through winter is going to be honey that they have gathered that is capped, that is in frames. And then they're going to be on that and they're going to cluster on that. What is pollen for? Pollen feeds the baby bees. So pollen is used by nurse bees. So that leads us into another thing. Can any of the bees take pollen on board and store and carry it in their stomachs or in their fats or on their body, other than the way a normal forager would carry pollen on its legs back to the hive? Yes, nurse bees can actually bring pollen bits into their metabolism, and they can store it in their fat, and they store resources that way. So, does it benefit us to add dry pollen? And in this case, he says pollen substitute. So let's keep that in mind. It's not real pollen. It's a substitute that generally comes in the form of dry, powdered pollen substitute. It's yellow. It imitates pollen bits. It's a very fine chalk dust consistency. And the only one that I know of that has a measurable benefit and that actually competes as far as what the results are for the bees, competes with real pollen, is the Ultra B dry pollen. So the thing is, this is about me personally. Remember, you're asking me what I would do. I don't like to put pollen inside the beehive anywhere at any time. That's because I think that pollen should be a resource that the bees can get. So I'm not against you putting out dry pollen in a pollen feeder specific. What I'm saying is I personally would not add it or mix it in with dry sugar, because the bees that are going after the dry sugar are not necessarily the bees that are going after pollen or benefiting from pollen. So I would not mix it with the dry sugar. When the bees fly out to get pollen, they're going to be bringing that in and they're going to start their brood with it. So the other thing is, if you create an artificial pollen environment where the bees think that pollen is coming in from the environment and that may be able to be sustained by the environment, that's when they start to rear brood. So the queen will start laying more eggs, they'll start using the pollen to make bee bread, and they'll mix that with some of their saliva and some nectar and some honey, and they're going to use that to create royal jelly, and then they're going to start to raise brood for the following season. If they do that too soon and the winter hardship remains and this pollen does not remain a resource, then they can actually create too much demand. Because it's a synthetic or an artificial pollen, I'm not a huge fan of that inside the hive. Although if the foragers are going to go out and get it, you want to make that available away from the bee yard, then I'm not against that. I just happen to have, as a reminder for myself, these are 3 test tubes full of pollen. And these are all collected by the same colony of bees at different times. Early in the season, this dark brown and light colored pollen was probably coming from clover and other floral resources that early bloom. Some of the yellow stuff kicked in here. That would be sometimes it's dandelions and others, but look at the mix. That's what I really wanted to show, is that there's a variety of pollen sources here. So it's this mixed pollen. Now here's the thing. This is pollen that was collected by bees, that was on their hind legs, and that the workers were bringing in, and they were going to actually put it in the cells. And then of course the nurse bees were going to come along and they were going to amend that with some of their resources from their mandibular glands, and they were also going to contribute their own nectar to it, and they're going to work it into bee bread. And so that's actually going to go through a fermenting process. So these pollen palps, these little balls that come in with the bees, have not been through a lot of processing. They have, if you see bees raking the pollen back to their hind legs, they're grooming their faces, their eyes. They're also raking across their mandibular glands, which are just above the mandibles. And they're streaking that down, straking it down, and they're adding that to make the pollen collect and stick so they can put it on their hind legs. So the sweetness that comes, for those of you who are eating pollen for whatever reason, the sweetness in that comes from what the bees have done in the field before they bring it back to the hive. Mixed with nectar, mixed with their own glandular material. So there is some metabolized material in with this, but this is not the pollen that gets fed to the baby bees because it is not bee bread yet. So, but the reason I bring this up, I was noticing the way bees use or do not use pollen that's brought in by the field workers. When you're using a pollen trap, which I did on one hive this year, and when I pulled the drawer out, some of the pollen, of course, the bees were still going through the screen area, even though the bottom portion was open. And so these bees that had the pollen balls on their legs, as they went through and they fell off on the landing board, I thought, oh, this is great, because now let's look and see what happens to these pollen balls, because I always thought if you have a solid bottom board, and sometimes pollen just falls off the legs of bees as they get in there. They don't quite get it to a cell, and then the worker that brought the pollen in normally scratches off their legs and pushes the pollen in, and they leave these little pollen balls in the cells. So sometimes they don't get it that far. They'll get knocked off on their way in and they just fall to the bottom. And I always thought because you have a solid bottom board, the bees can reclaim the pollen that falls to the bottom, but guess what? They don't. Yeah, it was really interesting. So the honeybees that are inside the hive, when these little balls of pollen were falling on the landing board or just inside, sure, they all run over and they lick it and they work it over because it's sweet and it does have a nectar portion to it. But they're not after the pollen, they were just after the sweetness, and then those pollen balls just laid around on the bottom, and guess what else happened? They went moldy. They go moldy because there's pollen there and there is a sugar resource too. So this material is just going to decompose, which is why you have to wash out. Now they will clean out the bottom board. They're not going to just let little moldy bits and pieces. The way I saw the moldy pieces were in things like the flow hives that had the slides, the trays that go in the bottom. So now the little balls of pollen fall through that, go into the tray, and then nothing else has access to it. They ultimately start to mold. So the bees don't use it. So unless the pollen is turned into bee bread and fed to baby bees, the pollen that's brought in from the field really isn't used. So the question would be, if you mix dry pollen substitute with dry sugar, which is also a substitute for honey, what's going to happen to the pollen? And will it actually be of any use to the bees? So if you have any kind of acquaintance or somebody in a lab that's doing studies on that, bee nutrition and which bees will actually glean pollen substitute from dry sugar and how and where they would use it, that would be very interesting. But for me, there's no evidence right now that shows that that would be a benefit to the bees, and it's just the potential for something else in your sugar to spoil. That's why I keep it out. So we don't want them to kick off brood prematurely. We want them to do that foraging. If they're going to bring in a pollen substitute, I want that to coincide again with weather that facilitates foraging. I don't want the bees to all be confined and then we're boosting their diet some way. So for me personally, no, and that's my reasoning. It's because of the way that I've seen them ignore pollen when it wasn't brought in directly from the field. And so we're faking out the bees when you put this pollen substitute out in a feeder. When they go foraging and they're looking for pollen resources on early plants, which normally would be trees at the beginning of the year. And by the way, I put the dates on the caps of all of these so I know when they're foraging and what they're getting and when the pollen is the strongest, so for my annual record to see what's going to happen. But when they can fly out and they start to get pollen, they start to bring that in, and that's a natural rhythm. That is a natural time for them to start producing brood and building up for the spring nectar flow. So I would much rather let that come from nature. Now, if you're in an environment where those resources almost never show up in nature, you might be in a bad place for beekeeping overall. If you're in frequent dearths and you're just doing this to help your hives limp along, then that's going to be harder. I don't live in an area like that. Where I live, every time I've put out a substitute, pollen substitute, for example, the bees didn't use, I had like 3 bees in it. And they didn't come back a lot. So they really didn't care about it. And that's because the environment already started providing a lot of pollen resources early on. And from what I was trying to explain with this, the diversity of pollen, not a single source, the diversity, all these different colors, all these different little pollen sources provide, it's like you having a variety in your diet. You're going to have a better quality result from that nutritionally when there are several sources, and those are natural sources. So that's my take. It's not necessarily bad. You should just be aware of what the potentials are, that it could kick off brood rearing too early, and that the environment may not be supporting what you're artificially providing inside the colony. So number 2, this is from D Animal Reviews. What is your opinion on a long lang inside a backyard shed that has been insulated for winter and summer? Well, a long lang is reference to a long Langstroth hive. So the Langstroth hive, the removable frame beehive, is what most of us are using. And of course, we know that when we expand the hive, first you have a brood box, that's the bottom, and then you have supers that stack one upon the other. And these frames are aligned with one another and the bees build up. So we're simulating a hollow tree. The long lang simulates a hollow tree that fell over. So instead of the vertical buildup, which means you have to be tall enough to access it, you have to be lifting boxes off and so on, there's another method. If those of you have ever looked at a top bar hive, it's the same principle. Top bar hives will only have top bars, and they're primed with wax, and then the bees draw a natural comb down, and then also generally, if you look longitudinally down the length of that hive structure, it has angled walls. So with the long lang though, the walls are not angled. The walls are vertical and the bottom is squared, and it accommodates the standard Langstroth frame. So for visualization purposes, this is actually a drone comb foundation, one piece, but this is the size of it. So a long Langstroth box would be built with shoulders inside, little rabbet cutouts so that it would support the frames like this. And just as with any other hive, you would start with maybe 3 or 4 frames of brood or drawn comb, or you can install package bees and they're going to build out. And as they fill each of these frames, you're going to add another frame to provide them more space for expansion. So instead of building up higher, they build horizontally. What's the advantage of that? Well, you never have to pick it up. You never have to pull the boxes off because there's only one long box. So the long Langstroth hive would be built to accommodate the maximum capacity of all the frames that you think that you would ever need. And that means that there's empty space beyond the frames, but then there's something called follow boards, which are solid boards that the bees don't pass through. So the bees are working the frames in here, and then as you see all these frames are full, well, then you move your follow board over and you install another empty frame for them to expand in that direction. And so the brood and everything remains in the middle 3, 4, 5, 6, or however many frames of brood you have. And then the honey, of course, gets stored outward from that. And it may go asymmetrical. They may build all of their honey off to one side or the other. So you would start in the center of this long box, this long coffin-looking thing. And my opinion about it is, I think it's cool. I think it's cool for a lot of reasons. Number one, you can look in on them often. You don't have to lift the boxes. You can look frame by frame. You can add frame by frame. There's no lifting. If somebody were handicapped, if somebody were in a wheelchair, let's face it, a lot of people that get into beekeeping are retired. A lot of people do it as a gardening pastime as well. They add it to their backyard. You might be elderly, they might be arthritic. There are any number of reasons why somebody would not want to be picking up and moving heavy boxes full of honey. So the Long Lang has real potential. I plan to add one, who knows when. As far as needing to put that inside a shed, I mean, that's convenient and that's cool because you could work it in the rain, you could work it in the snow, you can get in there and look at your bees. I don't know yet if I'm going to do that. I definitely have space inside a building to do that, but I kind of like the idea that they're out in the open. And the reason is because you're going to build a permanent structure. That's how I see the Long Lang. You know, it's like a fallen log. Let's make it thick, 1.5 inches thick, 2 inches thick. Get some real timber and make that thing out of it and mill it down. And then just install as you would any other beehive, only now horizontal instead of vertical. Have it at a convenient height. Guess what? We're not going to have any skunks or anything trying to get into it because it's going to be probably the working height of it will probably be about the height of this table. So we might say 28 to 32 inches in height. And then you lift open the top, which should also be thick insulated material because remember, we're imitating a fallen log. And because we don't lift it, who cares how heavy it is? So make a really solid support system for it. And look it up. Do a YouTube search, horizontal hive, horizontal Langstroth, and you can find out that some people absolutely swear by them. Now in my area, I have spoken with people that started off with the top bar hives, and not one of them got their top bar hives through a winter season. So that has not worked out really well. And one of the differences between the top bar and the Long Lang is with the Long Lang, as I showed before, you're already working with full frames. The top bars just had the top bar, so the rest was natural comb all the way down. And so when you pull it up, you have a much more delicate structure because there's no frame to work with. So I prefer the Long Lang concept over the top bar hive concept. Top bar hives have gone back, and they're popular in a lot of areas, just not here because I've given a lot of bee presentations to a lot of beekeepers and those who are just beginning beekeeping, and those who started with top bar hives because they thought that would be a great thing to have, nothing panned out. So I'm going to try it. I'm going to build one. We're going to see how it goes. I'm going to make it bigger than it needs to be because if there's wasted space, who cares? But if you run out of space, now you got a problem because it is a structure that is constant. You don't expand it. You don't latch more boxes onto the end of it. It's all one big piece. So I recommend for those of you that are going to build one, probably make it longer than you think it's going to need to be. And then you've got those follow boards, remember? So you've got an artificial end of the colony structure that is movable. And so plan for something larger than it, you never know. The other thing is maybe you can have, a barrier board in the middle and you can have 2 colonies in the same Long Lang structure under the same support system. That could be kind of cool. You could even put a roof over it or something. So yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I'm going to be doing that. I would not put it in a building, and there are a lot of people that seem to want to add heat to a hive. They want to put it in a heated, warmed building, and I'm going to suggest to you that that is not a great idea. And the reason is, the bees that we're keeping in areas, I'm in Pennsylvania, in the United States, northeastern United States, and as you can see outside, it's very cold. We get a lot of snow and everything else. I want bees that can handle this environment. If we're warming the bees and we create an artificial weather system inside the building, then they're going to be active longer through the year and they're going to consume their resources more. And these will not be bees that we know to be acclimated to the environment that we're keeping them in. Keep in mind that the bees ultimately one day will swarm, they'll send their genetics out. I don't want bees that have to be kept in an insulated building that's heated in the winter and cooled in the summer. I want bees that are hardy enough to handle those environments on their own, and that's why we're working with Saskatraz bees now. So that's my opinion. I'm going to try one. I'm going to make a cool one. Next, people last time sent me lots of questions about the Saskatraz bees that I talked about. They were very frustrated. If you're a beginning beekeeper or you want the bee weaver bees, how do we get the bees? They don't ship packages and everything else. Well, Saskatraz, which I do not have a final word on because I'm still evaluating them. There's a lot of buzz about them. You can buy packages. Where do you get the packages? There's a breeder authorized to breed the Saskatraz line, which is in the state of California. One of the biggest manufacturers of beekeeping supplies, probably in the world, is Mann Lake. Mann Lake is selling the Saskatraz package bees. I already ordered 2 for next spring. So if I don't need them come spring, then I've got 2 coming in, then I can occupy. I have lots of empty hives. I can add hives to my apiary. Right now we're at 15 colonies. I want it to be 10, but we're testing other things. So I've got 5 extra colonies going into winter, which will better my chances of ending up with at least 60% of those come spring, I hope. But I'll put a link for the Mann Lake order for the bees. Mann Lake's kind of iffy about giving you a date. Someone asked me, when you order your bees, you get to pick a date when they're going to be delivered. No, you don't. Mann Lake tells you when they're going to deliver them. You don't get any options. They're going to say, we'll send you a notice out maybe a week in advance, I think. Last year, they wouldn't notify me about anything. So you just have to be ready to get your bees. So packages are available. Order them now because here's the thing. If they sell out, you're just going to be out of luck for the bees that you want. And then, yeah, so that's it. Mann Lake, order them now. If you want those packaged bees. But there again, I don't have a bottom line on them. I don't know how they've wintered yet because I bought them in the spring. We're going to talk about them a little more today. Anyway, the next question from St. Germain. You said last week that this was your best year, thanks in large part to the overachieving Saskatraz bees. So we're just talking about the Saskatraz bees. I get a lot of questions about them. So can you share how much money you got from how many production hives? And then he wrote back later and said, ooh, it's not supposed to be money. It's supposed to be how much honey you got. Well, in general, I don't like to talk about money, which is what I told St. Germain. But then I said, it's bee economics. Who cares? And by the way, he calls these production hives. So let's just be clear about something. I'm a backyard beekeeper. I'm not a commercial beekeeper. So my bees are not being kept for profit. So I'm not looking for ways to increase honey production, or I definitely don't sell pollen. You know, that was an experiment because I evaluated pollen traps and I wanted to see what the impact was on the brood and everything. Anyway, but I will give you an account. So we're going to go head to head. Those I knew to be Saskatraz colonies, started with 3 this year. Those that I knew to be bee weaver colonies, and I had 3 of those. So we had 6 colonies that we could consider in production. So and keep in mind, sometimes when you install a package, you shouldn't really expect to get resources off of those your first year. And let alone put flow hive flow supers, that's what that is. If you put a flow super on a colony, it better be a super productive colony because they may not even touch the frames. They may not seal them up and they may not put honey in them, but the Saskatraz bees did. If you don't know, Saskatraz bees are new this year. Down in the United States, they are and were developed up in Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada. So they authorized a breeder in the state of California to go ahead and breed the Saskatraz line, and then of course to sell them here in the United States. That way we're not importing bees from out of country, which can be a huge mess. So they're being bred in California, and then people are buying packages and they're shipping them around. So my top performing Saskatraz colony of bees installed this year that was put in a Flow Hive 2 that's a flow hive too, and it was a 10 frame size, which is 7 flow super frames. I know it's confusing for some people. We got at least, I know we got more than this, but I can verify that we got at least 10 gallons of honey from that one colony. So from one Saskatraz colony, we got 10 gallons. The next Saskatraz colony going over, we got 7 gallons, which was also on a flow hive. And the third Saskatraz colony, I didn't get any honey. Yeah, you know why? Because I just put supers on and left them on. So I want to let them go into winter. They each have at least a medium super of honey on them, but my third Saskatraz colony, I didn't take any honey off because I wanted to see what they would do. Guess what they did? They built up really fast. I didn't take honey off, and they swarmed, and now they're not pure Saskatraz bees anymore. Those are the ones that have the little golden bees in that colony now, which we talked about before. So, but then we go to the weavers, my top producing weaver colony, and keep in mind I've had these for years, but they all requeened this year because they all swarmed. So are they pure weaver stock? Not necessarily. If you've got hygienic varroa resistant bees and they don't breed directly with other hygienic varroa resistant bees, that hygienic traits and the varroa resistant traits are watered down and are diluted. The only way that they maintain full survivor stock like that is when they breed with others that are also surviving. But anyway, one of my weaver colonies got 6 gallons. Number 2 weaver colony yielded 4 gallons, and another weaver colony yielded 4 gallons. So let's talk economics. We might as well mention the money. We get people that say, if I buy a flow hive, I just spent $700, $750, depending on the flow hive, you might have spent $800. When will I get all my money back? Well, let me tell you what, if that thing yielded, if you took that flow hive and you put Saskatraz bees in it, you could have pulled 10 gallons off of that. Each gallon is 4 quarts. Each quart, this is a quart, that sells for $20. So you've got $80 per gallon, 10 gallons, $800. You could have paid for that one the first year. Now that's an unusual situation. So you would have got your money back the first year, but on average, a flow hive for me would not pay for itself unless it has been through 2 full years first. So after that second year, you're in clear profit zone for the honey. But of course, if you have to buy in new bees or new queens or other things, there are a lot of other costs that impact that. But anyway, from 5 production colonies, because remember the 6th one was not harvested from, 31 gallons, 4 quarts at $20 per quart. That is $2,480 from a backyard apiary. Now, what about tax on that? The state that I live in, honey's a food. There's no food tax. So that's $2,480 minus the cost of your jars, your lids, and anything else that would be considered a consumable or an expendable that gets used up in that production. But with the flow hives, how long do flow hives last? I pulled my original flow super off this year and will not be putting it back on. So that's from 2015. It went into production in 2016. So we got 3 solid years out of it. And it's not that it's ruined. It's just that now, because it's all cool looking and worked up by the bees, it is what I want to bring with me to show people and to talk about beekeeping and one of the methods that we can use to take honey off. So it did not degrade. So the frames keep going. So anyway, that's a quick economic description there. 5 colonies, $2,480. It's unpredictable. It's agriculture. If you had a bunch of rain, this was an unusual year. Bunch of rain, unseasonably wet, cold, everything else that could impact your bees. Agricultural practices are always at the mercy of the weather. So we just had a really fantastic year. We're loaded up with honey. We have honey coming out the wazoo around here. Anyway, and if you're wanting raw honey and you want to get it from me, I'm sorry, it's all spoken for. So thank you, though, for thinking that it would be good honey for you. Next question is from 6 Deep 6. I wonder if you could mention how your slatted racks worked out this past season, and also follow up if your bees let you keep those upper vents open. So slatted rack, we put this on this year. What's a slatted rack? I did a whole video about it. In fact, I was holding this in the cover image of the video, so if you find it, you could look at that and I'll explain it more. This is a slatted rack. This is for an 8-frame box. Slatted racks, how did they work out? They worked out really good as far as I could tell. Now, did they meet all the claims that I read about before I bought them? No. People say that if you put a slatted rack in, you won't see bees bearding on the front of your hives. That was not true. They bearded anyway. The principle was that they're supposed to be able to gather in the space under here, so your forages gather there, and then on these really hot days or days when they're dehumidifying the honey, the bees won't be collected outside your colonies and they won't beard. Now, did they not beard as much as hives that did not have these? You could say marginally it looked like that was the case, but here's the real bonus to it. Remember, we're just now going into winter with these, so I haven't been through a winter, which with this ladder rack, this is towards the front of your hive, so this solid board here cuts down on the amount of light that's coming through the entrance reducer underneath of it. It's also supposed to cut down on winter, air, and when those blowing storms come, it's supposed to cut down on drafts up inside the colony. So that's yet to see if, it's yet to be seen if that's going to do that or if it changes anything as far as the configuration goes. The other thing was that if you look at a brood box and you look at the frames in the deep brood box, which is your bottom box, the queen generally starts laying eggs all the way down to the bottom of the comb, but they always leave a gap just before that bottom ridge, and then they're arced over here. So the claim was, if you've got slatted racks, then the queen will perceive this as a darker space, a protected space, so she'll lay more eggs further down. Was that the case? No. So what happened was it didn't really do all the things that they said it was going to do. It still might be great for wintertime. What it is good for those of you who are doing oxalic acid vaporization, and you use those oxalic acid sublimation irons that go in through the entrance board, usually those would be, especially when you let it go, the iron would impact the bottoms of those frames, which have wax all over them. And you'd be killing bees because the bees that get on that hot iron die. And what these do is provide a very convenient utility space for you to do that vaporization and not bring your iron in contact with the actual brood frames. So that's a plus. The other thing is, on the back of all of these, when I install them on my hives, I drill a 1/4-inch hole right here because I use the ProVape 110 for oxalic acid vaporization for the colonies that need it. Now, because I don't know going into the season which colonies are going to need it, I drill the holes anyway, and I put a 1/4-20 threaded thumb screw in there as a placeholder. And if I ever need to treat the colony, the hole is already there. We can put it in there and vaporize the colony without having to drill a hole in the box itself. I don't have to go through the entrance board. I can cover that up with a nice damp cloth, and I can do this from behind each colony. So for utility purposes alone, the slider racks are cool. So do I like them? I like them. Do they meet all the claims that were made about them? In my opinion, they really don't, but it's not a total waste if you're a commercial beekeeper, which we're not, we're backyard beekeepers, but commercial beekeepers don't like the added expense. The trade-off for the benefit, what's the benefit? Will that turn into a return on their investment? Probably not. For the backyard beekeeper who has to have everything that benefits their bees, put a slatted rack in there. Because it's cool and it works to some degree, not a lot. All right, and what else? Mention your slatted racks, follow open your bees, keep the upper vent open. Did the bees let me keep the upper vents open? No, they did not. So I have feeder shims on top of all the colonies. What's a feeder shim look like? These are my own. They're super heavy. We put them out because I put rapid rounds in here. This is where you feed rough stock, rough cut wood. And of course, this one has not been in a beehive, but this rough cut bottom surface here in all of the hives got covered with propolis, so it became part of a propolis envelope, which is a way that the honeybees fight bacteria inside their hive. They propolize the surfaces, and if it's a rough surface, they're going to seal that up, and so you just created a germ barrier, so to speak. Now the hole in the center gets covered by a rapid round. So this thing is in there from the other side, of course. Plugs this hole, which is how we got into the discussion. Without these holes here, now we've just got a solid cover that is not ventilated. So some people are interested in venting their hives through the top. So that's when we came in and I put 2.5 inch holes on the back part of it, which would not be blocked by the feeder. They have stainless steel screens in them. So then the point is, on the front of this, you can control venting. So that's a vented spot. And then the thinking is too, you can turn this and close it up for winter or whatever. So I decided that that would be cool because then the bees could vent through that. Well, every single one of the colonies that I put a feeder shim like this on, they had the vented holes. They sealed them solid with propolis. So not one colony allowed the top to be used as a vent. They also sealed and glued up the bottom sections of the rapid round feeders against the hole. So they didn't want any top venting. Now this might be regional. So if you have bees in the south, they might love those vents. They might leave them open. They might need a top vent. They might be dealing with a high humidity situation. Where I live, the bee's opinion, if they're demonstrating that through their propolizing practices, they do not want upper vents in any of their hives, including my observation hive. The observation hive that I have is actually in a building that gets the full cold experience. It is not sealed off except from wind and rain and things like that. So those bees, there are 1.5 inch insulation, firm rigid board insulation on the faces because that's the glass part of the observation hive. It has 4.5 inch vents, 2 high and 2 low, and those are all sealed solid with propolis. And what the bees did on one of the lower vents is they opened up a tiny 1/2 inch area that is moderately venting. The rest of them are solid with amber colored propolis. So they don't want venting on that either. So did the bees let you keep the upper vents open? No. So does that mean I'm going to stop putting those stainless steel screen vents in my feeder shims? No, I'm still going to put them in. Because if the bees decide later that they want to open those up and the vents are there, they can do it. If they leave them sealed up, fine, but I'm leaving the bees some options. They can chew out their propolis. They've demonstrated it before. And when the weather's warm, they generally don't chew and manipulate propolis when it's freezing. So, but if it warms up and they feel like they need venting, they can chew that out themselves. So as I said, I will still put the vents in the feeder shims. I will still have that front controller on. And I did not use any upper entrances this year at all. And the bees all did extremely well. So we're kind of, adapting to what the bees are telling us that they like. And one of the things they like is to have their tops weatherproof, airtight, no ventilation through the top. So thanks for that question. Next, did you resolve your live frequently asked questions issues? They think it's a great idea. Okay, well, I'm glad those of you who tuned in and saw my iPad temporary live stream where I was trying to read questions and nothing worked out, and then I just said, that's it, we're quitting. I have figured it out. So now that it's winter, now that it's snowing, now that we're going to get stuck inside, and hopefully my photography work, tapers back a little bit. I'm doing a lot of cinematography work this winter time. And so I should have the time to sit back and actually do a live chat, kind of. So we'll come in. Now, the other thing is people posted, I appreciate the interest in this. Other people posted dates and times that they would like to have chats happen, and they could be in the middle of the week. Somebody said Sunday. Weekends were good. I'm thinking Sunday afternoons. That's what suits me. And can't do it every Sunday afternoon. And some people said that they were disappointed. They wanted to, engage in a live chat discussion, but they didn't have any advance warning. Well, yeah, because I was just testing it. So I just flipped it on, tried different things out. And now it works. Now I can see the feed. I can see the questions that people would post and things like that. So I'm going to try it again. There may not be any prior planning on it. I might just, have an hour free and get a cup of coffee and go sit down and say, well, I'm going to turn on this chat thing now. So what I've done is I set up a chat station. Yeah, just for that. I mean, it'd be cool to do it here, but I don't have any broadcast capability right here. This is a shielded area. So notice there's no noise or anything. So down here in this steel reinforced, you know, YouTube bunker. I'm just kidding. It's not a YouTube bunker. I'm in a tent in my backyard right now. So anyway, we're going to do it. It works. We're going to do that coming up. Maybe even test it out tomorrow for like 10 minutes or something. You know how that goes. If it's live, you could start out thinking 10 minutes. Next thing you know, an hour's gone by. So for those of you who told me that you want to see that, thank you. Thank you for being interested in that. I think it'd be fun just to answer just-in-time questions. You post your question, we talk about it. Next one, Homer Sturgill. I'm going to try your wasp experiment. Please post an update. For those of you who don't know what my wasp experiment is, my backyard apiary always gets assaulted in years past by yellow jackets. Thousands of yellow jackets are humming around. It didn't matter if you're taking honey, whatever you're doing, yellow jackets were on people. They're after the bees. They fly when it's really cold. The bees haven't warmed up yet, so you see those cold weather yellow jackets going right in the landing board, and nobody's defending because it's too cold for the bees yet. So my idea was, when I saw paper wasps that were not putting up with yellow jackets, there are these brown, rust-colored paper wasps, and I'll put a video up of them. They were chasing off the yellow jackets, and so I thought, those paper wasps never attack the bees, and you never see them zipping into those openings and rolling around with the bees, stinging back and getting stung by the bees. So because they don't fight them, but they are a wasp, and they do help displace yellow jackets by, they have the same food resources when it comes to pest control and things like that. But these paper wasps, specifically the brown colored ones, are very tolerant of people. You could be standing, there could be a paper wasp nest right here by your head. You can walk by it every day and they do absolutely nothing. You can also stare right at them. They don't do anything. You can study them. I've actually taken paper wasp nests out, put them right on the kitchen table, and watched the baby wasps hatch out. That's how passive they are with people. So what I've been doing is I collect them and I put them in little 3-sided wooden rough cut boxes, and I mount them different places and let the nests develop as they would, you know, wherever they would choose to live. And then that way I increase the paper wasp numbers in the vicinity of my apiary. And then the result the hypothetical result is that they're going to displace yellow jackets, and I'll have less yellow jacket pressure on my bees. Is it working? I don't know. But this year we got fewer yellow jackets attacking the bees. So, but I've done other things. I'm feeding the bees in an open feeder away from the colonies. And so that's cut down on the yellow jacket traffic there. If you have any kind of syrup or nectar or kind of open feeders in your apiary, get that out of there and move it well off from your apiary, and you will draw the robbers and wasps and hornets and other things away. And so maybe the combination of that and my paper wasps benefited my bee yard, because I had no full conflag battles on the landing boards going on, which normally happens every year. You know, there'll be a bumblebee that lands and tries to get in. There'll be 6 bees rolling around on it, and there's a battle royal there for a little bit. But the yellow jackets used to cause these big landing board skirmishes. They were really trying to rob out the colonies. And that did not happen once, not with any colony this year. So, is that because of my paper wasp experiment? That is yet to be seen, but I'm going to continue doing it. So I add paper wasp nests all around my apiary and along the building of my observation hive. And it seems to displace the yellow jackets, because those paper wasps don't let the yellow jackets stick around. So maybe it works. Plus, they're pest control too. So that's a win-win. Thank you, Homer, for asking about them. And that's ongoing. I don't have any final declaration about whether that works or not, but it is cool to have wasps around that people can look at up close and not be stung by. So it's a win-win. Next is Russ Makem. Is it safe to say that bees exiting and wiping their faces are robbers? All right, when you're looking at your landing boards, and I hope you do a lot, When you look at landing boards and if bees are robbing one another, it becomes very obvious. But there are some behaviors that you'll notice right away. One is when bees are robbing, they're zipping in and out really fast. There's none of this inspection area. Normally, bees are landing and going in when traffic numbers are low. The guard bees touch each bee, sniff each bee. Who are the guard bees? The ones with their front legs up, and they go like this at every, and their mandibles open at every bee that comes in. If you see a conspicuous absence of those guard bees on the landing board, and you've got bees coming and going in and out of there, you need to pay close attention to that colony because they may be defenseless for a reason. They may be occupied inside fighting more closely with bees that have made it through the entrance. Honeybees can rob one another out in a very short amount of time, and they get a feeding frenzy going. Now, what's the behavior? When the bee comes out, as described here by Russ, when they come out and they're wiping their faces, so they use their forelimbs, and you even see them stick their tongue out, and they use their forelimbs and they'll run it down the length of their tongue. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's a robbing bee, but there are other things that tell you that that bee has just taken on more food than it can handle, and that happens a lot when they're robbing and getting into the resources stored by a strong colony that has collected a lot of resources through the year. So when they successfully get through their guards and they start robbing it out, and we're talking about there's going to be a lot of activity, you're also going to see secondary examples of robbing, little bits and pieces of wax and propolis, because they're going to chew the wax, they're going to get into them, and they're going to rob them out. So you'll see bits and pieces of wax and particles dragging out. You'll also see some dead bees if the struggle has just begun. And you won't just see honeybees going in, you'll probably see some wasps getting in and out too. Now, what's the other physical behavior of wasps that have recently taken on more food than they can handle? When they're robbing, it's kind of like when you see these videos of law enforcement when there's rioting going on and people are running out of stores, they busted up the windows, they're carrying more things than they can handle. Their pockets are full, they've got everything under their arms. Bees are kind of the same, they overfeed. So the secondary thing that you would see is bees on the landing board, or bees that leave the landing board, they can't fly very far and they're stuck all over the grass around. Look at their abdomens. They start wiggling their abdomens in these circles. And that, in combination with them grooming and rubbing themselves down, is evidence that that bee has overeaten, because they've got a full honey crop in their abdomen and they're trying to manipulate and orient themselves before they fly, and so they're actually flexing their abdomen a lot. So when you see that abdomen twirling behavior in conjunction with that grooming behavior, that bee is full of resources and it's probably overeaten. We know that bees can fly with about 30% of their body weight, so they can be really loaded. And those that have go near a feeding station sometime when there's a lot of resources there, the bees will cling to everything around the feeding station, and that's because they've overeaten. They found an abundance of material and resources that they want. They overload, they fly out, now they have to park until they actually get rid of some of that weight so they can fly home. So just that in itself, look for the secondary behaviors. Bees that are robbing tend to zip straight in. There's no landing board hanging out, getting acquainted. There's no, touching of tongues and taste testing to see what's coming in and that kind of thing. Robbing is a frenzied, aggressive behavior, and there will be secondary evidence that that colony is being robbed. So you look for that. And guess what? That's the last question for today. So I hope you benefited from something we talked about. If you have questions that you'd like to have answered yourself, then please write them down in the comment section. I hope I can get to those next Friday. Most of the questions I write down in my notes here come within the first 3 or 4 days after a video like this one posts. I'd like to respond to questions that are relevant to the time of year, the season that we're in. We're going into winter right now, so we're doing preps for next year. This is a great time of year to start to stage equipment for spring. Order your bees, get up to speed, watch some YouTubes, learn some stuff, share what you know. Those of you who have been posting pictures on my Facebook page, Fred's Fine Fowl, we'll put the link down in the video description. Go to that because that's cool. Let me tell you something. The people that are posting pictures of their beehives that they've made and the artwork that they're putting on them, and it's amazing. And it's fantastic to be able to share there, and I'm glad to see people talking with one another. But show your pictures, share your information there. If you've got a photo of your beehives, your bees, your favorite colony, whatever you want to do, Post that stuff there. If you're a spammer, you get blocked right away. But guess what? There hasn't been a single spammer yet. So that's cool too. So thank you to those of you who are posting pictures of your beehives and sharing your information on the Facebook page. And thank you again to those of you who post your questions here. Hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope you're warmer than we are. Thanks for watching.